At around 7:15 on a January evening in 1989, a woman in Westchester County, New York, picked up her telephone and dialed for help. She got through. That part is not in dispute. An operator at New York Telephone heard a woman's voice. The woman said someone was trying to kill her. Then, the line went dead. The operator did exactly what she was supposed to do. She alerted police. Officers were sent, and they arrived at an address where nothing was happening. Because the reverse directory used to match that phone number to a street address was out of date. The call was real. The emergency was real. The address was wrong. Betty Jeanne Solomon was 40 years old. She had a husband, a teenage daughter, a job at a collection agency, and friends who called her BJ and described her as someone who gave people the benefit of the doubt. She would not be found until nearly midnight, more than 4 hours after she reached out for help. That gap, those 4 hours, is where this case really begins. Not with a mistress, not with a movie title, with a clerical error in a phone directory. Almost nobody tells the story that way, which is part of the problem. The call reporting the death came in just before midnight from Betty Jean's husband, Paul Solomon, a 40-year-old elementary school teacher. He was frantic. He was also, at first, calling the wrong police department. The couple's complex sat inside Greenberg's jurisdiction, not the one he dialed. That was quickly sorted out, and officers arrived. What happened in the next hour matters more than most retellings admit. Paul Solomon told police he had come home, seen his wife on the floor, assumed she'd fallen, and turned her over. He had blood on him. A patrol officer at the scene allowed him to wash his hands and change his clothes. Understand what that means procedurally. Gunshot residue testing measures microscopic particles deposited on skin when a firearm is discharged. It is time-sensitive and easily destroyed. Once Paul Solomon washed, any residue test on him was scientifically meaningless. When it was eventually conducted, it came back negative. And that negative result told investigators nothing at all because the sample had already been compromised. Was that a cover-up? No, there's no evidence of one. It was something more ordinary and, in a way, more troubling. A first responder extending a kindness to a man who appeared to be a grieving husband without the training to recognize that he was also, at that moment, the only person present at a homicide scene. This is one of the quiet lessons of this case. Investigations are rarely wrecked by conspiracies. They're wrecked by small human decisions made in the first hour by people who don't yet know what they're standing in. Inside the apartment, investigators documented the scene. A telephone receiver lay on the floor, the cord pulled from the wall. Shell casings were scattered. Betty Jeanne had suffered 9 gunshot wounds. And a few feet from where she lay, crime scene photographers captured something small and dark against the carpet. A black glove. Here is where a documentary has to slow down, because the single most consequential decision in this entire case was made by a technician holding a chemical swab. Investigators tested the glove using a presumptive field test, a chemical reagent that changes color in the presence of blood. Malachite green, in this instance. The test came back negative. On that basis, the glove was not collected into evidence. Presumptive blood tests are screening tools, not verdicts. They are designed to be fast and cheap, and they are known to produce false negatives, particularly when the amount of blood is very small, when it is dried, when the material is dark or absorbent, or when the swab simply misses the stained area on an item. Every forensic textbook says the same thing. A negative presumptive result narrows priorities. It does not scientifically establish absence. But in practice, on a chaotic scene at 1 a.m, a negative result functions as permission to move on. So the glove stayed, and then, at some point, it was gone. Nobody has ever produced a satisfying account of how an item photographed beside a homicide victim ceased to be in the apartment. Paul Solomon was later asked whether he knew where it was. He said he did not, and that he had looked for it without success. 3 years later, between Carolyn Warmus's first trial and her second, Paul Solomon reported that he had found a black glove in a box in a closet in his home. He turned it over to prosecutors. It bore a small amount of blood. That glove became the centerpiece of the trial that convicted her. We'll come back to it, but hold on to the sequence, because it's the spine of everything that follows. An item is photographed at the scene, is not collected, vanishes, and reappears 3 years later in the possession of the victim's husband, the man who had originally been the prime suspect. Paul Solomon was, initially, exactly who you would expect investigators to look at. He was the husband. He had found the body. He had a history of infidelity. There were reports about insurance considerations. He would go on to sign a lucrative deal for the story rights to a case that had not yet been tried. And then investigators learned about Carolyn Warmus. She was 23 when their affair began in the fall of 1987, 17 years his junior, a colleague at Greenville Elementary School in Edgemont. She was also the daughter of Thomas Warmus, a self-made Michigan insurance multimillionaire whose assets were reported in the range of $150 million, jets, yachts, estates in 4 states. The affair was not distant or discreet. By some accounts, Warmus had been in the Solomons' orbit socially and had taken their daughter Kristen on a ski trip. After Betty Jean's death, Paul Solomon began seeing someone new. Months later, when he and his girlfriend traveled to Puerto Rico, Warmus turned up as well. Solomon reported to police that she was following him. Warmus said she had been invited. It was also alleged that she contacted the new girlfriend's family while impersonating a police officer in an attempt to break up the relationship. Whatever the truth of any single incident, the cumulative effect on investigators was decisive, and the case stopped being about a husband and became about a woman who would not let go. This is worth naming precisely because it recurs in case after case. Investigators are human beings, and human beings reason through stories. Once a coherent story is available, obsessed young woman, older married man, wife eliminated, every subsequent fact gets sorted into it. Details that fit are highlighted. Details that don't are set aside as noise. Psychologists call it confirmation bias. In an investigation, it doesn't feel like bias. It feels like clarity. And in February 1990, 13 months after the death, Carolyn Warmus was indicted. No witness mattered more to the prosecution than Vincent Parco. Parco was a New York City private investigator whom Warmus had hired years earlier to look into a previous boyfriend. He testified that Warmus had repeatedly pressed him to obtain a firearm for her, that she cited neighborhood burglaries and a woman in Westchester who concerned her, and that in January 1989 he sold her a .25 caliber Beretta with a silencer for $2,500. He testified that the silencer had been his suggestion. The gun was never recovered. Parco was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. That immunity grant is not a scandal in itself. It is a routine and often necessary prosecutorial tool. But it changes what a jury is being asked to do. A witness testifying under immunity is not simply a person recounting events. He is a person who has been given something of enormous value and who understands that the value is contingent on the usefulness of what he says. The defense hammered this. Warmus's first attorney, David Lewis, forced Parco to acknowledge his own attraction to her and advanced the theory that Parco, allegedly working for Paul Solomon, was the actual perpetrator who had then framed his client. It was an aggressive theory. It was never proven, and no charges were ever brought against either man in connection with Betty Jean's death. But there is a postscript that jurors in 1991 and 1992 could not have known. In 2019, the same year Warmus walked out of prison, Vincent Parco was sentenced to 1 to 3 years after being convicted of attempting to blackmail a witness in a child sexual abuse case. Having reportedly arranged encounters with sex workers and recorded them, in order to secure that witness's silence. That does not retroactively make his trial testimony false. Courts have consistently held that later misconduct doesn't automatically unwind an old conviction, but it does raise a legitimate question about the assessment two juries were asked to make with far less information than we have now. How do you weigh the word of a man whose profession involves obtaining things other people cannot legally obtain, who is testifying under a promise of protection? The first trial opened in January 1991 and ran close to 3 months. Prosecutors built a circumstantial architecture. Friends who testified that Warmus had become fixated on Paul Solomon and had expressed a desire to take Betty Jean's place in his family. Telephone records showing a call from Warmus's Manhattan apartment to a New Jersey gun shop. Testimony that ammunition had been purchased using identification belonging to another woman, a colleague who said she had lost her license months earlier. The defense answered with an alternative timeline. Phone records, they argued, showed a call from Warmus's apartment at 6:44 that evening, after which she drove roughly 45 minutes to meet Solomon. If that call was hers, the geography does not work. The prosecution disputed the records. The defense also called a building contractor named Joseph Lisella, who claimed to have overheard 2 men in a Yonkers bowling alley restroom shortly after the killing, money changing hands, and a remark about a gun being in the deepest part of the river. On cross-examination, prosecutors attacked his credibility and drew out that he had been in contact with Warmus's wealthy father. That is a lesson in itself about defense strategy. A witness who seems to deliver everything you need is also a witness whose motives the other side will examine minutely. A dramatic story that collapses under cross-examination can cost more credibility than it buys. After 12 days of deliberation, the jury reported it could not agree. The split, later reported, was 8-4 in favor of conviction, mistrial. Think about what that means. 12 ordinary people heard the affair, the obsession testimony, the phone records, and Vincent Parco, and a third of them still would not convict. The second trial began in January 1992 with a new defense attorney, William Ehrenwald, facing substantially the same evidence. Except for one thing. Prosecutors now had a physical object, the glove Paul Solomon said he had found in his closet, and they had credit card records establishing that Carolyn Warmus had purchased a similar pair roughly a year before Betty Jean's death. Ehrenwald objected furiously to evidence surfacing this late. He argued the prosecution could not prove the glove was hers, and pressed the theory that Warmus was being framed. Neither DNA testing nor its admission occurred. The technology was in its infancy in 1992 and not applied here. On May 27, 1992, the jury convicted Carolyn Warmus of second-degree murder and criminal possession of a weapon. She was sentenced to 25 years to life. She spoke before sentencing, saying she had not killed Betty Jeanne Solomon and did not want to spend her life imprisoned for something she had not done. Analysis: why one object moved 12 minds. Here is the question a good documentary has to sit with. Almost nothing changed between the two trials. Same affair, same witnesses, same phone records, same immunity deal. What changed was that jurors could look at a thing. There is a well-documented asymmetry in how people process evidence. Testimony is understood as a claim requiring evaluation. A physical object is experienced as a fact requiring explanation. Jurors know that witnesses lie. Objects feel like they don't, but an object only means what its history says it means. And the history of this particular glove is the weakest part of the case against Carolyn Warmus, not the strongest. It was photographed, but not collected. It went missing under circumstances no one has explained. It re-entered the case through the hands of the person the defense was actively accusing. Chain of custody exists precisely to prevent this. It is not bureaucratic fussiness. It is the mechanism that lets a court say an item now is the item then. Where the chain has a 3-year hole in it, the object's evidentiary value should logically go down, not up. For at least 4 jurors in the first trial, the case without the glove was not enough. For 12 jurors in the second, the case with it was. Whether that shift reflected the glove's actual probative weight or its psychological weight is a question the record cannot settle. It is also the question that makes this case genuinely instructive rather than merely lurid. We should talk about the title this case was given, because it did real work. Fatal Attraction was released in 1987 and became a cultural event, an enormously successful thriller about a woman who will not accept the end of an affair. When Betty Jeanne Solomon's death reached the tabloids, the comparison was immediate and irresistible. The label was not neutral. It was a pre-written ending. It told readers before a single piece of evidence had been tested in court which character each person in this story was. The obsessive young woman, the weak husband, the wife as backdrop. By the time of the first trial, Newsweek was reporting that 3 books were in progress and 2 movie deals had been signed before any verdict existed. Paul Solomon's own story rights arrangement had been among the reasons investigators had initially looked at him closely. The commercial adaptation of this tragedy was underway, while its central factual question was still open. Notice also what the framing erased. Betty Jeanne Solomon was a person with a career, a marriage of nearly 2 decades, a daughter, and a reported history of considering whether to leave that marriage. In the Fatal Attraction telling, she is not a protagonist. She is the obstacle. That is a failure of storytelling with moral weight, and it is one this genre repeats constantly. The appellate history is its own commentary. Carolyn Warmus's direct appeal was not decided by New York's Appellate Division's Second Department until 2006, 14 years after her conviction. The court affirmed. It described evidence that she had become obsessed with Paul Solomon and had expressed a desire to take Betty Jean's place, and stated that Vincent Parco sold her the weapon that fired the fatal shots. 14 years is an extraordinary interval for a direct appeal, and it illustrates something worth knowing. Post-conviction review in the United States is not a prompt safety net. It is slow, procedurally narrow, and heavily deferential to what a jury concluded. There is an unsettling parallel here. In the same county, in the same era, a teenager named Jeffrey Descovich was convicted in December 1990 of a 1989 killing. Despite DNA testing that had already excluded him, he served nearly 16 years. In 2006, he was exonerated when DNA testing identified the actual perpetrator, who then confessed. Descovich has since become an advocate for others claiming wrongful conviction and has publicly identified what he considers red flags in the Warmus case, including the late emergence of key evidence. That parallel proves nothing about Warmus's guilt or innocence. 2 cases from one county in 1 decade is not a pattern. But it does establish that the systems handling both cases were capable of getting one badly wrong, and that jurors in that time and place were capable of convicting in the teeth of forensic doubt. Warmus was denied parole in 2017. Parole boards weigh institutional disciplinary records. Hers was cited. And they also weigh expressed remorse. This creates a genuine bind for anyone maintaining innocence. Acknowledging responsibility improves release prospects, and refusing to do so can extend imprisonment. She refused to apologize for something she said she did not do. She was granted parole in 2019 and released from Bedford Hills on June 17th of that year, after 27 years. And then came the development that, oddly, receives the least attention of anything in this case. In May 2021, on the eve of an appellate hearing, Westchester County District Attorney Mimi Rosa consented to DNA testing of 3 items: the glove, biological evidence recovered from the victim, and blood found in a tote bag belonging to Paul Solomon. A previous district attorney had agreed to testing in 2017 and then reversed course. A judge had denied the request. Warmus had appealed. The consent was granted. Modern DNA technology can extract profiles from quantities of material that were useless in 1992. According to publicly available records, none of that evidence has ever actually undergone DNA testing. Not tested and inconclusive. Not tested and confirming the verdict. Simply, as far as the public record shows, not tested. There are mundane explanations. Evidence stored since 1989 may be degraded, contaminated by decades of handling under 1980s protocols, or missing outright. Testing requires funding, laboratory scheduling, and agreement on protocols. Cases where the convicted person is already free lose institutional urgency. None of this requires bad faith. But consider where that leaves the case. A conviction that turned on a single physical object. An object whose custody history has an unexplained 3-year gap. Technology that could, in principle, say something meaningful about who handled it. Permission to run that test, granted years ago, and a silence in the record where a result should be. Carolyn Warmus was convicted by a jury, and that verdict has been affirmed on appeal. Paul Solomon was never charged with any crime and has denied wrongdoing. Those are the facts of record, and this documentary does not claim otherwise. But the strongest reason to keep examining a case like this one is not the possibility that a jury got it wrong. It's Betty Jeanne Solomon. She called for help, and the call went to the wrong street. She has spent nearly 4 decades as a supporting character in a story named after a movie she never saw the end of. Her daughter Kristen was 15. If the glove holds an answer, someone should want to know it, whichever way it points. That, in the end, is what a full accounting would look like, and it is still right now available to be done. Physical evidence tends to feel more trustworthy to us than testimony. But this case shows how much depends on where an object has been. If you had been on the second jury, would the glove have persuaded you, knowing it surfaced 3 years later in the home of the man the defense was accusing? Tell us how you'd have weighed it. Cases like this remind us that some questions continue long after the headlines fade. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime stories. We'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary.